Welcome to this lecture on tetanus. After this lecture, you'll be able to discuss the origin of tetanus, describe the structure of Clostridium tetani, the mechanism of action of tetanospasmin, the symptoms of tetanus, the treatment and prevention of tetanus, and also you'll be able to discuss the epidemiology of tetanus. Firstly, we will discuss the origin of the name tetanus, which was termed by Hippocrates around 25 centuries ago. It is from the Greek tetanos, which means contraction. Tetanus, or the bacteria Clostridium tetani, was first discovered by German Jewish physician Arthur Nicolaier. It was discovered in soil-injected mice who produced pus that contained the bacteria. The disease is characterized by muscle spasms and muscle rigidity. Next, we'll talk about the general structure and the characteristics of Clostridium tetani, the bacteria which causes tetanus. Clostridium tetani is a rod-shaped bacillus, obligate anaerobe, saprophytic, and gram-positive. Since it's an obligate anaerobe, it cannot thrive in an aerobic environment. This is due to a lack of enzymes, which neutralizes hydrogen peroxide. This bacteria is also saprophytic, which means it acquires its nutrients through decaying organic matter. Next, we'll discuss the taxonomy of Clostridium tetani. It is part of the genus Clostridia, and Clostridia are gram-positive, saprophytic, spore-forming, and anaerobes, and located in the soil or the gut flora of animals. There are approximately 209 species of the genus Clostridia, and most of them are non-pathogenic. Pathogenic ones include the classic examples C. difficile and C. botulinum. Next, we'll talk about the different types of tetanus. There are 4 types: generalized, cephalic, localized, and neonatal. Generalized tetanus is referring to tetanus affecting muscles throughout the body. Cephalic tetanus is tetanus affecting muscles of the head. Localized tetanus is tetanus affecting specific muscles localized in certain parts of the body. And neonatal tetanus is speaking of tetanus affecting newborn infants, usually through an umbilical cord procedure. Next, we'll talk about the symptoms of tetanus. So the initial symptom is flaccid paralysis, which is actually the opposite of the classic symptoms, but we will discuss that later on. The other symptoms include trismus, also called lockjaw, which is tetanus affecting the chewing muscles, which includes the masseter, and dysphagia, which is a difficulty of swallowing caused by tetanus affecting the swallowing muscles, rhizus sardonicus, which is tetanus affecting the facial muscles, resulting in an abnormal smiling position, and epistatonus, which is what we see right here in the diagram. And this is a condition in which tetanus is going to affect the extensor muscles of the neck, the trunk, and the lower extremities, resulting in a abnormal arched back position. More serious symptoms include tetanus affecting muscles or structures of the respiratory system, such as the respiratory tracts, the larynx or abdominal muscles, and this actually could result in decreased respiration or actually a complete halting of respiration, which is a very serious case. So next, we'll talk about the Ablett classification. So this is just a method to assess the severity of tetanus in a patient. So it goes from grade 1, the most mild, to grade 4. And this is really pertaining to whether the patient has upper airway obstructions, which is going to be the most severe case. And the mild case just is mild generally, and in regards to there being no respiratory problems. So next, we'll talk about the structure and the function of tetanospasmin, which is the tetanus neurotoxin, also abbreviated TENT. It is a zinc-dependent metalloproteinase, which means it's an enzyme with catalytic activity. And specifically, this toxin is going to target a certain protein in the neuron, which we're going to discuss later. It is 150 kilodaltons in size, and it has 1,315 amino acids. It is a peptide with 2 chains, a heavy chain and a light chain, which is connected by disulfide bonds. Interestingly, if you look right here, the light chain LC and the heavy chain HC have specialized domains. So the light chain has the endopeptidase domain, which is responsible for catalytic activity for cleaving our target protein. The translocation domain is responsible for the movement of the toxin inside of the neuron. And the receptor binding domain is responsible for helping the toxin attach to the neuron. So next, we'll talk about the pathogenesis or the pathophysiology of a tetanospasmin. So tetanospasmin targets the lower motor neuron terminals, which are synapsing with the muscle cell. So right here, we have tetanospasmin, and it goes into the axon bulb of our motor neuron. And what you notice here is that the axon or the endosome is actually acidic in its environment. And this is going to create these pores right here in the endosome. And that's going to allow the tetanospasmin to go out into the axoplasm. So the tetanospasmin actually also cleaves itself, and the light chain, which is the catalytic part of the tetanospasmin, is going to target a certain protein on the vesicle right here we see that contains a neurotransmitter. So that protein is going to be called synaptobrevin, or also VAMP. So when tetanospasmin targets that protein, it's going to cleave it. And that's bad because synaptobrevin is actually responsible for inducing exocytosis. And this happens when the VAMP protein actually binds together or interacts together with these other 2 snare proteins. So these all 3 of these proteins are categorized as snare proteins. So when they form a ternary complex, this is actually going to result in the exocytosis of this vesicle containing neurotransmitters. So if our tetanospasmin cleaves VAMP, this neurotransmitter is going to stay here. So what happens next? Does tetanospasmin just stay here in the motor neuron? And the answer is no. It actually travels up the motor neuron and goes towards the spinal cord, towards the interneuron terminals. And this traveling upwards of the motor neuron is called retrograde transport. So once it goes to the interneuron, it's going to actually do the same thing. It's going to target that protein, the VAMP protein, in a vesicle. But in the interneuron, there's going to be different neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters are going to be called GABA and glycine. So let's look at the next slide. So here we have our motor neuron that we saw earlier, and the tetanospasmin traveled upwards, and it reached our inhibitory interneuron. So the interneuron contains vesicles that also contain GABA or glycine instead of acetylcholine like we saw earlier. And this is why the interneuron is called inhibitory, because GABA and glycine are inhibitory neurotransmitters. GABA and glycine, when they exocytose and enter the synaptic cleft, they're going to inhibit our motor neuron and prevent or inhibit contraction of the muscle. But when tetanospasmin cleaves the VAMP protein, it's going to prevent this exocytosis from happening, and GABA and glycine are going to be stuck here. And so this is going to result in the hyperactivity of the postsynaptic neuron. So it's not going to be inhibited, and that's going to result in the symptoms of tetanus that we see later on. So on another note, there's another disease that's actually similar to tetanus called botulism, but with the opposite effect. So botulism is caused by a bacteria called Clostridium botulinum, which produces the toxin botulinum neurotoxin, or BONT. And BONT is also a zinc-dependent metalloproteinase, and it also cleaves the VAMP protein. But on top of that, it cleaves the syntaxin and SNAP25 protein as well. And we remember that all three of these proteins were categorized as the snare proteins that are responsible for making sure that exocytosis happens. So the botulinum neurotoxin, what it does is that it cleaves these snare proteins and it prevents the acetylcholine at the motor neuron from exocytosing out into the neuromuscular junction. And this is going to prevent muscle contraction from occurring. And this is why the only really symptom of botulism is flaccid paralysis, or a reduced muscle tone. So interestingly, it also has 7 different serotypes. The neurotoxin has 7 different serotypes, and each of these different types of toxins are going to target different snare proteins. So next, we'll talk about the epidemiology of tetanus. Clostridium tetani is usually found in dense populations, hot, damp climates, with soil that's rich in organic matter. And so Clostridium tetani thrives in soil and in GI tracts where it's good and anaerobic. And it's really transmitted through invasive methods. So like puncture wounds, animal bites, pregnancies, surgeries, burns, ear infections, or dental infections. It's infectious, but it's not contagious. So you can't really transmit it across people. So next, we'll talk about kind of the historical statistics of tetanus. So in the early 1900s to 1940s, the mortality rate actually decreased for tetanus. And the reasoning behind this was because the toxoid vaccine was developed. And in 2001 to 2008, in those 7 years, only 233 cases were reported. And only 40% of those cases were actually vaccinated. So most of them were not vaccinated. Therefore, that's why they got the tetanus. 197 cases out of those 233 only had a 13% case fatality rate. The median age for the age of onset was 49 years old. And neonatal tetanus is actually even rarer. There's only been 2 cases reported since 1989. So the point is that tetanus is very rare in its occurrence. Next, we'll talk about the treatment and prevention of tetanus. In a person who actually has the symptoms of tetanus, the first treatment is going to be human tetanus immunoglobulins, HTIG, which is going to neutralize these toxins, removing them. But they cannot remove them if the toxin is actually bound to the axon bulb or bound to the neuron. So after the toxin binds to the neuron, you cannot remove it. So human tetanus immunoglobulins only remove free-flowing or free-floating toxins. So it can either be administered intravenously or intramuscularly, or if we have a case of general tetanus, what doctors do is that they administer HTIG intrathecally. Another method of treatment is debridement, which is the removal of necrotic tissue. And this is actually to prevent that anaerobic environment the Clostridium tetani really thrives on. So other treatments include antispasmodics, which includes GABA agonist benzodiazepines. So these benzodiazepines are going to actually encourage the release of the inhibitory neurotransmitters. And examples of these benzodiazepines includes baclofen, vecuronium, pancuronium, and propofol. So in severe cases, like we discussed earlier, if tetanus affects the respiratory muscles, basically treatments are pretty extreme. They include sedatives and mechanical ventilation, since the patient can't breathe by themselves. But usually that's not the preferred treatment, because mechanical ventilation can really exacerbate the condition, because in tetanus, physical contact can actually make the spasms worse. So in order to avoid those physical contacts, basically a tracheostomy can be an alternative treatment. Also, patients with tetanus are on a high-calorie diet, because the increased contraction or the hypercontraction of the muscles increases the metabolism as well. So the patients need more energy. And lastly, we'll discuss the prevention. And we all are familiar with the vaccines, which is really the only 100% effective prevention of tetanus. So the tetanus toxoid is part of the vaccine. It's an inactivated vaccine. The antigens activate the T helper 2 cells and subsequently the B cells, and it really induces active immunity inside of the host, which is going to give a stronger response down the line when the patient is exposed to the bacteria and the toxins. And usually the tetanus vaccine is in conjunction with other vaccines, so it's combined together. So examples of this is DTaP, which you might have heard of, which includes the vaccine for diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis, or Tdap, which is tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis together. So in summary, you learned that tetanus is caused by the bacteria Clostridium tetani. Clostridium tetani produces tetanospasmin toxin, and the tetanospasmin inhibits inhibitory interneurons, which produce the inhibitory neurotransmitters. This results in the hypercontraction of skeletal muscles due to the lack of regulation of the motor neurons. And tetanus is treated and prevented mainly with HTIG, or human tetanus immunoglobulins, or toxoid vaccines. And we learned that tetanus is really rare in the present age when we're talking about the US. Thank you for listening to this lecture.